I don't want to grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has a hundred questions.
I particularly want to welcome friends of the Alameda Library, and especially the many friends of Eric Yao and Castro Valley Science and the Castro Valley Education Foundation. My name is Tucker Hyatt. I'm the founding director of Wonderfest, the Bay Area beacon of science. Dr. Dan Kammen is professor of energy and founding director of the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory at UC Berkeley. That's RAEL, I believe it's pronounced. He also has positions at Cal's Energy and Resources Group, at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and at the Department of Nuclear Engineering. These positions just hint at Dr. Kammen's accomplishments. Dr. Kammen's, I wanted to give him the island, the Cayman Islands, but it's not true. After earning degrees in physics at Cornell and Harvard, and postdoctoral positions at Caltech and Harvard, Dan earned an assistant professorship at Princeton, and then finally settled on the academic summit at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. Dan has authored or co-authored 12 books and has written more than 300 peer-reviewed papers, including reports of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Professor Kammen has testified more than 40 times before both state and federal congressional committees. He's a frequent contributor to Time Magazine, the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Financial Times. He's appeared on 60 Minutes twice. And in 2003 and 2007, he gave his first 2 Wonderfest presentations. All right. Join me in welcoming not an underachiever, Dr. Dan Kammen.
Well, Tucker, thank you all for being on, and I see a whole bunch of friends on, so I really appreciate you being here as well. I'm going to try to take very seriously the dialogue question and answer part of the story. So I'm going to show some slides to kick us off, but I'm going to do them at the speed reading rate, meaning I'm just going to use them to illustrate a couple topics that we come back to. So I'll try to keep all those comments in the next 20 minutes to give us the full second half. And there are a couple things we might want to go back to. And I didn't work this out in advance with Tucker and the team, but I will make these available through either my own laboratory's website, which you can see here, rael.berkeley.edu, or something with Wonderfest, depending what's easier. And maybe we can, in the background, figure that out during the hour so that we'll be able to make it directly available to you. So this is the website of my laboratory. And it is a place where we work on decarbonization from individual household level to individual pieces of technology. So the world of micro energy, of mini grids as it's called, but also up to the national and regional scale. And right now I'm actually on leave from Berkeley. I'm serving as the senior science advisor at the US Agency for International Development, with a focus on Africa, but not exclusively. And I'll reflect that in the slide. So let me jump in to really do my best to preserve the time available to us. So let me just start with something which is now old. It's from 2015. And this is the picture of the decarbonization pathways that we had planned out for the Paris Climate Conference. This is the meeting where the so-called 2-degree guardrail became the law of the land, or the desired law of the land. And what this graph shows is the path of emissions we were on. That's the beginning of this, whatever aquamarine color. But the path we were on then was to warm the planet by more than 4.5 degrees Celsius. And just to put that in context, that means more than 20 degrees at the poles. That means sea level rise at the poles, and disruption at the poles would be catastrophic very quickly, because most of our ice sits in Antarctica. If we melt all of Antarctica, that's 65 feet of sea level rise. And if we then, or beforehand, we would melt Greenland first, that's another 20 feet. And if you think about any coastal city, that 80 feet basically ruins the day. That is pretty horrific. So the agreement that was struck in Paris was that countries would invest in their so-called nationally defined contributions, NDCs. And there's a long backstory. We can come back to it on the questions that people want. But basically, each country picked their own mixture of things they would do. The US said that we would cut our emissions by a third by 2025. We then had a little election that didn't really go the way of climate, to put it mildly. And we backed off that. China said they would peak their emissions, something which they said they would do by 2030, something they may have already done. But that only cuts off about a degree. And from there, we needed additional contributions to come in, so-called extra needed innovations, a little bit larger than what countries committed to. Not that they did, but they committed. And so that was the need for continuing investment in innovation and research, et cetera. And that's really the justification for people like me in academia and many of my colleagues to keep working on things. All that said, there were a couple key events that happened. I was working in the Obama administration at the time, and part of the dialogue with China and other countries was that we would agree to fund not only the projects in red, which we have not done, but then also to invest new innovation in the gray. Something we have done to a little bit, but nowhere near the degree we need to. But that was when the target was 2 degrees. A lot of science has happened since, and it's clear that 2 degrees would essentially wreck the planet, meaning 2 degrees of warming would wreck the planet. And we have already unambiguously warmed by 1.2 degrees. So we have very little headroom left. But since then, we have said the target needs to be 1.5 degrees. And if you just look at this graph, you'll notice that 2 degrees means we basically have to cut emissions to close to 0. 1.5 degrees means we need to go negative. And there is a vicious battle brewing about, is going negative something that we want to do by either burying carbon or reflecting sunlight back into space, something I'm not a big fan of. But there are things we would need to do to make the target beyond the quote unquote simple job of zeroing out all of our current fossil fuel use. So big job piled on top of additional big job. That's the context. The climate meeting we just had in Glasgow, COP26, was the first time that we saw significant private sector commitments, $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion here and there, adding up to the amount of money that we promised way back in Paris in 2015, but never delivered. And that was to make $100 billion available each year to industrializing nations. Hasn't happened yet. Many people are skeptical, even the commitments just made will be honored, but this is the first time they've been added up. And as a result, countries like South Africa, powered almost entirely by coal, with a massive unemployment problem today, and those who are employed are largely in the coal sector. South Africa committed to zeroing their emissions by 2050, but they did so with a promissory note from the US, Germany, UK of $8.5 billion. We think it's going to cost more like $100 billion. So the amount they've been promised is really just a starter on this package. And while we look at climate change with a lens like this is a now famous picture from Lake Tahoe, kind of looks like something out of a Mel Gibson Road Warrior movie. This is kind of a very much a elitist picture of climate change. This is some fancy doc on Lake Tahoe, horrific that it is. It doesn't begin to talk about the social, racial, and environmental injustices, the inequality of who will suffer when. And that's really what I want us to focus on today. But just to put more of the climate change we've already seen into perspective, this is just a view of Lake Havasu in the 80s when I was in school, and now today, last year, showing water levels so low due to both climate change, the mega drought, but also massive human drawdowns of water, so much so that helicopters could not get in there to get water to put out climate-induced wildfires. You get the kind of the feedback loop story of our destructive treatment of the planet. I mentioned I'm at USAID right now, Power Africa. And part of the story is that we now have an incredibly rich and depressing suite of data about the degree to which climate injustice is facing the world's poor, not only more immediately than it's affecting the rich, but with much more debilitating impacts. And so there's a very nasty social dynamic going on in here as well. And that's one of the reasons why I joined Power Africa as my tour of federal service right now. With most of the 800 million people on the planet who don't have access to electricity in Africa, it makes it ground zero for climate change. And of course, everything we do today and the story about addressing climate change in the US, in Europe, is largely one of so-called electrify and decarbonize, meaning if we convert our energy to green energy and we use more and more of it in place of everything from energy for transportation to other sources, we get to a point where our ability to even provide the basic services is just not available to the world's poorest. Now, I mentioned South Africa, and I'll mention Nigeria as well. Nigeria at the meeting in Glasgow, COP26, also committed to decarbonizing their economy, and they are an oil and gas economy, to put it mildly. So the two biggest emitters in Africa, those two countries are more than 50% of the continent's gross national or gross continent product, but both of them would suffer literally millions of job losses if we don't find a way to not only replace dirty with clean, but do so in a way of a just transition. And so that really sets the groundwork for the story. Power Africa is the US leading edge of deployment. We are part of efforts to build renewable energy power plants to connect new people to the grid. And you just see a kind of a snapshot of pictures along the bottom, from household cooking projects to starting new startups, companies like Bbox that are providing basically home scale energy solutions, to meetings with the ministerial team from Nigeria when they made their commitments. And so these are all the efforts that we want to support internationally. But like so many things, we're really learning about our climate injustices at home. So here in California, we've had a very interesting start to our decarbonization pathway. We committed to being powered 20% by clean energy by 2010. We missed that target. We threw a bit of a mock party in Sacramento, but we made that target 3 years late. So 20% of our state energy comes from renewables, I'll define in a second. By 2013, our goal for clean energy in 2020 was 1/3 powered by renewables. And we are now at 40% or more powered by renewables today. In fact, in April of last year, we hit 95% powered by clean energy. And we're a state that is the 5th largest economy on the planet. So we're well above our 2020 target, despite arriving at our 2010 target late. And Tim, thanks for putting the conversion factor in. I admit I think in Celsius, but I should convert. Our 2030 target was 50% renewables, but when we passed Senate Bill 100 that called for us to get to 100% clean energy by 2045, we upped that number for 2030 to be 60% renewables. The other important footnote, not inconsequential for someone like myself who works mainly on solar power and energy storage, but is also a professor of nuclear engineering, is that California's target does not include large hydro because of the damage to river systems, salmon, silt, a whole variety of things we need for healthy river systems, nor does it include nuclear. Many other places that have green energy targets have nuclear as part of the mix. California and Germany are the two large economies that do not include nuclear, although we both cheat. In California and Germany, we both import nuclear from other states, so we get nuclear by wire, but we do not use it. So the question from Stephanie, where is California now with renewables? We are right now well over 40%. The only remaining nuclear plant in the state, Diablo Canyon, is going to close in 2024. And there is more than enough renewables to make up for that difference. The other part of the story is that hydro is a decreasing amount. It was never more than 9%, and it's on the way down. In fact, many of the scenarios that my group and other groups run look at hydro being essentially used as a form of storage, so not part of our frontline energy generation mix in even a decade. So those are part of the mix today, but solar and wind are the fastest growing components. And in fact, globally, more than 75% of all new energy installed anywhere in the world has been renewables, not only this year, but for the last 2 years. So progress is dramatic. This is just a slide reminding us of California hitting 95% renewables. You can see the renewable line here in green ramping up. We started to export power, so our imports went negative, that's exports. Hydro went basically to zero. Natural gas ramped down to be less than 10% of our average. And again, this was an unusual day. It was a Sunday. It was a very nice, clear day with wind, with good wind and good solar. But it highlights if we can do 95% now, by the end of the decade, we sure as heck can do 100%. Just to kind of round things out before we really move fully into Q&A, the justice part of the story is one that many researchers and many policy engaged individuals have really shifted their attention to. Earlier last year, Manuel Pastor, a faculty member at USC who runs their social and environmental justice group, and I wrote a piece about why even getting to carbon neutrality by 2030, which is not even yet the law of the land, will be too late for many communities in terms of the heat waves that are suffered by our migrant labor communities, by many people who can't afford their energy bills today. And so battles over how will we pay for, how will we keep utilities solvent while we go to more solar? How will we support communities that ramp up electric vehicles? There's a huge amount in the story, but the environmental and social damage part of not getting to our state targets, not only on schedule 2045, but earlier is a challenge. And if any of you saw former Governor Schwarzenegger's op-ed in the New York Times this week, he highlighted that in fact, we are not likely to even make our 2045 goal at the pace we're going. 2060, by some targets even further out, is when we would actually get there if we don't accelerate the deployment of clean energy. That's sort of the bad news, but it's also the good news because California has actually learned quite a bit. And we've learned lessons not only about how to get solar and energy storage deployed, but we've also learned stories about where we did not make the right kind of step in terms of social justice. And so there's many examples. I'll just highlight one that I've worked on both with two of my postdoctoral fellows who are both now faculty elsewhere, one at Tufts, one at University of Texas, but also one that I think highlights that even in a state like California that has some of the most forward-leaning environmental justice legislation in the country, and I'll highlight that in a bit, we've found that we have done things, quite frankly, wrong. So here is a study we did using an amazing data set provided by Google. And when you see those Google cars going around with their spinning cameras and they do Google flights tracking which rooftops have solar, this is a picture of the country, not just California, looking at the racial mixture of communities where we use census data to track down what the income was in those communities. And so you see we have people from below the poverty line, $26,000 a year is impossible, but that's the official poverty line for a family of four, which clearly doesn't work, up to people at $250,000 of income. And so what we did was we looked at communities and we categorized them as majority one racial group if they were more than 51% that one racial group. Now that's going to mean, of course, that the number of communities that are dominant Asian, dominant African-American at the high income levels is going to get small. So the error bars are going to go up at the high end. But what you see here is if we look at communities that have no majority, we're looking at that as the baseline of who has solar across the whole country, not just California. However, when we do add the data in for these different racial groups, if we look at Caucasian majority communities, what we see is that solar is almost 50% more likely, even at the lowest income level, for white majority communities. And it declines a little bit when you get all the way out to these very affluent communities. If you look at Hispanic and African-American communities, the story is exactly the opposite. And it's a bad lesson. 50% less likely to see rooftop solar, going up to 100% less likely in the highest income African-American majority communities. So this is not just a story about access and ability to pay for solar or get it financed. Something in our distribution and our seeding and our helping companies launch in minority communities is failing our process to make access to clean energy an equalizing or a universal good. So this is just one of the many data-centric examples of highlighting how even in deploying new clean technology, we persisted with many of the problems of the past. Just to kind of wrap things up, studies like this are finally getting a lot of attention, which is ideal. There's all kinds of different versions of things like this. And I'll send the paper around, Layla. We'll send it to everyone. But if you go to my website, RAEL, RAEL.berkeley.edu, and you just search for solar inequality or see those authors' names, Sergio or Sergio Castellanos or Deborah Sunter, you can download the graphs. There's also a Living on Earth, an NPR episode about these inequalities. And in fact, on the good side is that under the new Biden administration, they have reinvigorated and launched an office, the Office of Energy Equality, and that's a place where they are working exactly on these features. It's run by an amazing former professor of law, Shalonda Baker, who now directs a team putting money from the infrastructure bill to use in these areas. So let me just kind of wrap up in just a few closing comments, just to kind of give us a starting point for many of these comments. One thing is that President Biden, on his first full day in office on the 21st, he woke up non-president on the 20th, and so this was his first full day, signed an executive order that calls for the federal government to use a so-called social cost of carbon in all of their project analysis, not just energy projects. The social cost of carbon is a number that is somewhere between $50 and $100 per ton of carbon emitted to the atmosphere. Just to put that in context, the market price of carbon in California in our cap and trade system is about $20. It's about $14 in New England and the mid-Atlantic states where they are part of a carbon market. And it's about $24 right now in Europe. So it is a number that doesn't just reflect the market price. I don't think too many of us think that we're going to solve all of our social ills through a market, but there might be some true free marketeers. So this social cost of carbon brings in a wide range of costs, not only to human communities, but to ecosystems. And so the president has ordered all federal agencies to use it, knowing that when the federal government does that, they don't have to start doing it until next month at the minimum. It might be longer based on some politics on Capitol Hill. But that price is one that they utilize because when the federal government uses it, all of its contractees, and in particular the states, will then need to use it too, whether those states have progressive climate policies like California does or not. Then just to wrap things up, in California, as I mentioned, we do get a carbon credit on our bill. California raises about $11 billion a year right now on the back of our cap and trade system. And one of the most interesting features is the process that was spearheaded by then Senator Kevin De Leon, and that calls for California to spend 35% or more of those revenues on disadvantaged and frontline communities. And that's a really interesting statement because not only does it cause us to spend in these areas, but the Biden team, while campaigning for the White House, upped that, and they now are committed to spending 40%. So I'd like to say in some ways that California is the anti-Las Vegas. What started in California does not stay in California, thankfully, and thanks to people who work both at the federal level, but also people who work on the Berkeley City Council in terms of housing blocks. There's a variety of places where these actions really come into play. Just to wrap us up, there's kind of things that one can do that are not just about policies and spending. An interesting example of the benefit of diversity is something that happened at UC Berkeley this last year. And I won't go into the very boring, detailed inside the campus politics, but what happened is we committed to hiring one new faculty focused on climate and environmental justice. That was such a hit that the campus then said, let's hire 5 new faculties, and there are these 5 new faculties hired in this area. And then other departments who didn't get to be part of this hiring blitz of people working on climate justice. Meg Mills-Navoa here on the left, she works on environmental damage in refugee and migrant communities. Maya Cascarilla here in the middle, she works on urban environmental injustice with a focus on Tampa, Florida as a study site. So what happened was when these projects got launched, these hirings, other departments said, we want to do it too. And so by the end of the year, we had gone from 1 to 5 to 11 faculty hires, all focused on climate justice, opening up not only new academic areas of work, that's fine, but some academic areas of work do and some don't get into practice. But essentially everyone on this list is what I would call a scholar activist. They're engaged in very direct ways. AJ Pilar-Rossetti is working with the international public health community around the heat damage to poor communities. Bernadette Perez is working on agricultural injustice to migrant Latinx communities, largely through the US, the High Plains. This has really diversified and strengthened our academic standing while building a new generation of scholars to figure out things like that lack of solar in poor communities that I highlighted before. So I really will end here. Just last year, President Biden ran on Earth Day a global summit around clean energy projects, and it was highly influenced by the California style. This is right here, Erica Mackey, who runs Grid Alternatives, now called Grid, really the most decorated environmental justice group that installs solar on the rooftops of low-income homes and uses people who are leaving the prison system and high school dropouts as part of their trained workforce. And then Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm, a colleague of mine at Berkeley before moving on to the Biden team. There are lots more things, however, we need to do. An example is that the city of Shenzhen in southern China committed to converting their entire taxi fleet to electric vehicles. They went from 0 to 29,000 EV taxis, retiring all the gas taxis in 1 year. And they immediately had a kind of a hilarious but a real problem, and that is they immediately had long queues. I'm going to play this little video here. These are those EV taxis waiting to recharge, even though they already had the world's largest EV charging station with 600 charging bays in it. What they did, of course, was they worked with Silicon Valley to build an app to inform drivers where there are spaces. You can see there was a couple spaces here. Drivers use a point system. The more on time they are, the more they get to pick the better charging spots to get back there on the road. And once this app was launched, revenues for those taxi drivers went up by around 15% in the first month because they were able to sanely schedule their charging times. Here in Oakland, California, we're building eco-blocks, and this is community level projects with solar on every roof, but not owned by the individual, owned by the block, by the block consortium. They use the solar to charge up a battery system that then sends the power back to all the homes, as well as to publicly available charging stations, because one of the big problems of EV ownership is that it's great if you have a garage, But if you're living in an apartment building or a condo, it can be very difficult. So there are some real challenges. This is one of those sessions, people are sitting in their COVID circles on the block, where they're talking about how to run that homeowners association to make all of this work. Similar projects I'm not going to mention. This one is in the Congo, where a community project built a solar array on some disused land in the city of Goma, and is selling power to the rest of the city because the solar array is the cheapest and the most reliable form of power in the town. And I'm just going to end by highlighting that when we look around the planet now, these commitments to zero carbon goals vary by which year. I mentioned South Africa with their 2050 goal, Nigeria with their 2060 goal, China has a 2060 goal, but we now have commitments all over the place. What we don't have yet is enough action that is both spending enough money now and doing so in a way that we use clean energy to generate a more equal society, as opposed to protecting the climate, but not protecting people and ecosystems' rights. So let me pause for a second. I'm going to put up just that slide again with the information to let people catch their breath, myself included, and then we'll use all of the time that Tucker will let us go from here to get into any of these questions. And I'm reading the ones in the chat. So let me take a kind of a 5-second quiet break, and then Tucker, I'll let you decide if you want me to just jump from one to one, or if you want to kind of vet and custodiate them.
No, if you feel comfortable answering the questions that you read, that's great. Maybe I could start, because my question is so basic, perhaps embarrassingly so, but it might encourage those who aren't as learned in climate change as some of the questioners I already see here to go ahead and pop a question. And that is, at the start of your presentation, you talked about a principal downside of global warming, of climate change, being the rise of sea level. Can you help us remember what other often incredible downsides there are to climate change and affecting communities all around the world?
Yeah, so happy to. I mean, obviously, California is sort of the test bed for climate disasters, from the burning of our forests to the destruction of paradise. We have already seen the global warming summer fire season feedback, and I would go so far, and many researchers are now saying we are not only entered the so-called Anthropocene, the human climate era, but we have created a new 5th season of the year, where we used to have winter, summer, spring, and fall. Now we have those plus the burning season. And while the burning season is normally in late summer, as we saw just a few weeks ago in Colorado, we can get burning seasons in the middle of winter. And so we have created a season that itself creates climate feedback, because obviously those burning events not only are hugely destructive. In the fires we saw in Australia, the estimates were we were in the several billion animals killed in the process. But we are in a process now where those burnings then release more carbon that accelerates climate change, and they convert ecosystems from wooded, verdant ones to places that are just simply not as resilient. So that's one aspect of the story. A second one is that we are already seeing changes in our coastal currents. And we are very worried right now about the dramatic dieback of the California kelp forests as a direct result. Similar effects are being seen in South Africa, which also has its kelp forest community. So we're seeing effects right and left. And when we talk about the supply chain disruptions that we've been seeing due to COVID and a panic buying of all manner of things, one of the features that we have yet to fully realize, but it appears it's on our way, is we can expect, unfortunately, to see massive fluctuations in crop yields. And so if anyone has seen movies like Interstellar, where they play a scary science fiction version, all of the data is pointing towards these sorts of food shortages based on our growing demand and our weakening agricultural systems. And that is an area where a huge amount of work is now going on, because the The victims of that will be all of us, but the victims first and foremost will be the global poor and minority populations. So there is a roiling sea, if you will, of these sorts of disasters coming our way, including record temperatures, so that Siberia was warmer than anywhere else last summer, and the forest fires in Siberia were larger than the forest fires in California. And we have now gone to a level where we are burning 3 to 4% of the state each year in our climate change world. So a harsh dialogue. So let me jump into some of the other questions, and Tucker, feel free to jump back in as well.
I'll try
I'm going to do Eric's and then Jessica's right here, but I'll keep going through as long as people want.
Great.
So in terms of tax credits for residential solar, the federal government is moving to expand those in various forms. But what's interesting is that the model for many of those has been California. Now, California is an amazing solar success story in the sense that about half of all solar panels deployed in the country are in California. So something about our mixture of subsidies and good climate and a very environmentally educated population has worked well. And in fact, distributed rooftop solar, whether it's on a home like mine or a condominium building or a strip mall, has become such a big part of our mix that we routinely get to points where 50% of the power being generated during a nice spring day not only comes from renewables, but comes from those distributed rooftop renewables. That's a pretty amazing number. The downside is that through the ugly sausage making process that we do to go through licensing and rebates, the utilities do not get credit for that distributed solar as they have to meet their targets. And I mentioned California has a target now of being 60% powered by renewables by 2030. I actually predict that we will be there before 2025. But at the same time, the utilities aren't getting credit for it. They get credit for the big solar plants in the desert. And so one of the things going on right now is an incredibly painful and backwards battle going on right now, where our Public Utilities Commission has proposed a new ruling that the environmental community is livid about because it would tax people who have solar to a very high degree. Now, it would put a large burden on those solar families and it would slow down the amount of solar. The other part of the story, though, is that the utilities do need some added revenue from people who could so-called defect from the grid. So there is an argument that there should be a tax on each home or each condo or apartment building that has solar, but the amount they've requested, $8 per kilowatt, is very high. And the utilities have not demonstrated that they have taken progressive steps to make solar available to low-income households, despite a whole variety of state and some federal programs that would support it. So if you read about the battle over net metering, there are incredibly strongly held positions. Again, Governor Schwarzenegger's New York Times piece recently really highlighted the degree to which the PUC seems to be working against the state's desire to go green. Now, there are some good parts of this as well. This is not a simple issue. For example, there is a $600 million fund that would be built to help install solar for low-income households. And so all of these are aspects of the question asked. There are some federal subsidies available, but it's quite likely that if some of the leading states like ours block theirs or go away, this will send a very, very chilling message to the solar industry. And if I just layer on another complexity, much of the world's solar panels are currently manufactured in China. And you don't have to dig too deep right now to see that there is a battle over the human rights abuses of the Uyghurs in Western China, where much of that solar is being manufactured. So President Biden has taken a very hard political line on this. And it's led to things like canceling official participation, not athlete, but official participation in the upcoming the Beijing Winter Olympics. On the other hand, we have not built out supply chains for these materials working with many other countries. So there is a really complicated mix going on, and all of this is really in the churn at the moment right now. So there's a lot brewing here. So let me answer Jessica's question. I might have gotten it wrong. Yeah, let me do Jessica's and then jump to Camilla's as well. So the question is, will solar help a single person living in a small townhouse save money? How many years would it take to recoup the costs? Right now, if you install solar on a roof that you control, you don't have to own it, but control it so you can put solar on. Generally, the payback time is 2 to 3 years. And there are certain deals put out there by some of the solar installers, the Teslas, the Sunruns, the Sungevities, a whole variety of companies that can show you savings on your bill from the first month. So what I generally say now is there is no one who is a property owner who won't benefit from solar in the very short term. But that also belies this economic injustice, because low income and many people of color are in the lower income brackets for a whole variety of reasons. And so what it means is that our policies that do not aid people who are not homeowners very much essentially subsidize the more affluent off of everyone's paycheck. And so one of the features being worked on right now by the US Department of Energy and by a new and very thoughtful effort in the California government is how can we work with property owners to make the benefits of not only solar, but also energy storage available to those who are renters. And that story is not fully fleshed out, so we don't have an easy answer to that. But generally, I say if you own your rooftop or you control the rooftop because you're part of an HOA or something, you will start essentially printing money. You will have paid off your solar in just a matter of a few years. Well, I'll just jump around a little bit here, but let me do, they're running up to things. So for Camilla's question, why are solutions like natural gas and solar radiation management getting so much funding and media attention as opposed to these other ones? This is, in some ways, a $64 billion question. On the one hand, we now, after decades of battle, have a situation where solar and wind are now the cheapest new forms of power to install. In fact, a report came out last year that it's now cheaper to build a new solar or wind power plant than it is to simply keep operating a fossil fuel plant. That's a point that when I started into this field 3 decades ago, I would sort of kill for this day. And yet this day happened and not much changed. And the reason really is that the amount that we still continue to subsidize fossil fuels is between $1 and $5 trillion globally per year, which is larger than the total investment in renewables. And so there's a very heavy finger on the scale keeping our investment in these areas. And so why are we still building natural gas plants when solar and energy storage are cheaper? That is certainly part of the reason. And the other one that is both a technical and a metaphysical question is things like carbon capture and solar radiation management, which Camilla is highlighting, and that's doing things like putting mirrors in space or floating small metal particles in the atmosphere so they reflect back more sunlight, things that I have a little personal ill at ease with, to put it mildly. Part of the argument for that is what I said in the beginning. When we said we need to keep our warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, that means we will need to remove some of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's opened up a very appealing, sexy area of high-tech solutions. And while I think we're going to need a lot of high-tech, I keep coming back to a very, very famous quote from the 60s, and that is, Do not expect technology to solve your social problems. Solve your social problems and deploy technology to do it in ways that you want. And so it's a really hard part of the story, because there is a compelling argument. We're almost certainly going to need some amount of carbon absorption. I personally think that something called nature-based solutions is where we should start, not necessarily end. But by nature-based solutions, I mean, let's stop deforesting. Let's rebuild healthy ecosystems so that they absorb carbon naturally. And that would buy us more time to get these clean energy technologies more affordable. So again, let me just jump around to a couple of these here. Any movement on the nuclear direction? Well, this is a tricky topic, to say the least. Right now, the world has about 410 nuclear power plants. 100 of them are in the United States, another 60 are in France. So 2 countries are the main users, but many others are obviously as well. The current power plants like Diablo Canyon and all the other ones across the United States are plants that were designed in the late 50s, 60s, and at latest early 70s. The most recent nuclear power plant installed and turned on in the United States, the Watts Bar plant, was commissioned in 1976. These plants have proven incredibly expensive, largely because they are so long to build and require such a high level of redundancy and security because of the problems we've seen at nuclear plants. So the current nuclear model is broken, but never before have we had such an exciting mix of nuclear technologies being developed, and many of them are unconventional in the sense that they're not the big power plants you see if you drive down to Diablo Canyon. Those plants are at about 1,500 megawatts in size each. The new darling of the nuclear field is so-called SMRs, or small modular nuclear power plants, that are anywhere from 100 to 300 megawatts in size. That is a totally different business proposition. The first of those plants has now cleared all of the hurdles. They expect to generate their first power from a small facility in Idaho in somewhere in 2027 or 28, after doing the real construction ending in 2026. That company, NuScale, is a plant that really grew out of engagement with the Department of Energy. Bill Gates has a company. There's a whole bunch of new small modular companies out there. And they may change the equation, or they may just give us smaller plants that are also not cost effective. We don't know yet. The best story is that we would know in the early 2030s, because you got to operate it for a little while. And even if nuclear ends up being a huge part of our future, it's not clear we would be able to build enough of any of these by 2050 to meet our climate goals. That brings up both the fusion and the thorium question. Thorium is interesting because the US and India each have a lot of it. And so there is an argument for it on available resource side. The challenge, though, is that while in the 70s we thought uranium would be scarce because we stopped building reactors, uranium isn't scarce. So we actually don't need thorium in terms of augmenting the uranium supply. And the problem is that because thorium reactors are untested, we don't have any of them in the world, there would be a big research program needed. Thorium has some benefits, not a whole lot, and in fact, many of the thorium reactor proposals would actually be thorium-uranium mixed blend reactors. So I'm going to be a little skeptical on that one. On the nuclear fusion question that Miriam answered, and good to see her, Miriam, one of the really interesting features is that up until about 3 years ago, everyone had been saying that nuclear fusion using hydrogen or heavy water deuterium as the fuel was 30 to 50 years away. Suddenly, it's not only 10 years away, but MIT thinks they will have an operating fusion facility in 2025. So fusion may really change the game. And in fact, my byline in this process, and you're talking to someone who went through school in physics, not to be a professor, but to be an astronaut until I failed the vision test, was in fact that I actually think that by 2070, when I will alas be long gone, I think the world may be 70% powered by fusion, but half of it will be 93 million miles away, meaning half of it will be solar power because solar power is fusion. But I wouldn't be surprised if in 2070 we're half powered by fusion and half powered by solar. So we'll see where we get in that mix. So Tucker, we're at 5 minutes left. I've picked unfairly and jumped around. If there's any you want me to do the lightning version in the last 5 minutes, just let me know.
Well, a gent named Suresh asked a question earlier. I promised him, I didn't promise, but I indicated that if he would just type his question, he'd get it answered. There's so many good comments here. I'm having trouble.
There are, yeah.
Do you see Suresh?
I found it, okay. Is there any way to take all or most of the climate change provisions and Build Back Better, which is not going to happen as currently constructed, and push through Congress? I fear not. I fear not for two reasons. One of which is that I still have my insane hope that whether it's Manchin or one of the more moderate Republicans, that there will still be a vote that switches over so we get Build Back Better. But my worry, of course, is that it is exceedingly unlikely, not because of this president, but just because of our history, that incumbent presidents, whether they're doing good jobs or bad jobs, generally lose seats in the midterm election. And if that happens, it places the ability to get Build Back Better through at an even bigger disadvantage. And the challenge there is that not only will that set the US back, but a second element of that is that we in the federal government are already partnering overseas through a program called Build Back Better World, which is really based on us making our goals happen because other countries that want to partner and want to buy US clean energy products are waiting for this to get through. So finding a way to get this through the eye of the needle is, I think, the #1 job, and it's in fact the top of the White House's agenda, but it is really going to be hard. We are not right now, obviously we don't have the votes today, and the fact that we haven't been able to pick off any amount of bipartisanship is, I think, a sentiment about how badly the science for society nexus is seen as broken. Even if it works on a technical level, it is not working on a social side. So I'm normally seen as one who is just irrationally optimistic. This is an area where I am hoping for a breakthrough bigger than science, because I think that's what we're going to need here. So, Tucker, we're at 7:58.
You're so impressive. I can't believe your skill at reading questions while answering.
I see a lot of unanswered, so I feel some guilt here.
Well, look,
again, I will post a picture on Twitter after. If anyone wants to put questions or comments on Twitter, I'll try to respond back to them as well. And Tucker, we'll figure out some way to make the slides available, but I'll put a version of the deck on the website you can see right here. It'll be right at the top under new events. And so there'll be a way to download it from here.
All right, great. And I've mentioned Eric Yao's name so many times tonight. Eric will probably have a polished version of this video online at the Wonderfest Science YouTube channel quite soon. And Eric also is determined to invite you back, Dr. Kammen, to do another talk. This has been so nice. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all. This is a great conversation. Next time or sometime in person.
Okay, you get final applause here. I just want to remind people of the event on Wednesday afternoon, February 16th. It's entitled "The Way to the Universe" with physicist Professor Michael Dine at UC Santa Cruz. Please visit wonderfest.org for more information. I end tonight by offering 3 big thank yous. First, to our terrific Zoom audience. Thank you for coming out tonight and attending so carefully and asking so many great questions, making strong, informed comments. Thank you also to Wonderfest supporters and formal patrons. You're so kind to support Wonderfest. And finally, how about for everybody, a big American Sign Language inaudible applause for Dr. Dan Kammen. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you all. Really appreciate you being on.
So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists. Naming something doesn't mean that we get it. So I'll live each day